Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at the Soviet shield and the Red Wings over China. Now, if you know anything at all about the early days of World War II in Asia, you've undoubtedly heard of the legendary Flying Tigers. They're an absolute staple of wartime history. But what if I told you there's a hidden history that predates them completely, a totally forgotten chapter that honestly changes everything we know about the early days of the war and the defense of the Far East? Well, that's exactly the story we're going to uncover today. So I've got to pose this question directly to you, because most people draw an absolute blank here. Who actually saved China's skies before the Flying Tigers even existed? It's one of those questions that really challenges our basic historical assumptions. And to find the answer, we kind of have to strip away what we think we know and look at the terrifying, truly desperate reality of the year 1937. Because by the end of October 1937, the situation for the Chinese Air Force was nothing short of catastrophic. Their absolute best pilots had been killed in action, and they were teetering right on the brink of total collapse. I want you to think about the sheer massive scale of China, and then consider this number, 12. They had exactly 12 operational aircraft left to stop the relentless, devastating bombing raids that were just darkening their skies.
All right, let's get into Section 1, the desperate vacuum.
To really grasp the gravity of this forgotten history, we have to understand the absolute desperation China faced while looking for any possible lifeline. You might be wondering, well, where were the obvious allies? Where was the US or the UK? The reality is, those Western powers were completely restricted by their own strict neutrality laws. Their hands were legally tied, keeping them strictly on the sidelines. And this complete absence from the skies created a huge, desperate vacuum. If help was going to come, it had to come from a totally unexpected place. And help actually did arrive. Which leads us right into Section 2, an unlikely alliance. Because that help came from literally the last place anyone on the global stage expected, the Soviet Union. Just look at this dynamic for a second. On one side, you have Joseph Stalin. On the other, Chiang Kai-shek. You would be hard-pressed to find two leaders with deeper, more fundamental ideological differences. Yet, this alliance was built on pure, unadulterated political pragmatism. It was the ultimate execution of my enemy's enemy is my friend. You see, the Soviet Union was deeply motivated to weaken Japan, to ease the imperialist threat pressing against its own borders. And to do that, Stalin launched a massive covert military operation. That brings us to Section 3, building the Soviet shield. What's just truly staggering here is the sheer scale of this deployment. This wasn't some minor gesture or a token offering. It was the construction of what became known as the Soviet Volunteer Group, a literal defensive wall in the sky. Look at these numbers from 1937 to 1941. Over 2,000 personnel. We're talking highly trained pilots and crew. They brought in 4 complete fighter squadrons and 2 bomber squadrons. In total, they supplied China with over 1,200 advanced aircraft. 1,200. Contrast that massive influx against the desperate number 12 we saw just a minute ago. It is incredibly clear how this covert operation single-handedly kept the Chinese Air Force from just disappearing off the map entirely. And this quote brilliantly illustrates the human element driving those statistics. Claire Chennault, who was an American military aviator acting as an advisor in China at the time, observed these volunteers up close. He described them as extremely tenacious and energetic. These pilots and crews were enduring grueling, round-the-clock operations, literally pushing themselves and their machines to the absolute breaking point to hold the line. So how did all that tenacity actually play out in combat? Well, let's look at Section 4, the Wuhan Trap. This is the story of the most brilliant air battle Claire Chennault had ever seen. Setting the scene here is absolutely crucial. The date is April 29, 1938. Why is that significant? Because it was the Japanese emperor's birthday. The sheer audacity of choosing this specific, highly symbolic day is incredible. Chennault and his Soviet commanders knew the Japanese would be hungry for a major victory to celebrate, so they used that predictability to set a massive, high-stakes tactical ambush. Here is exactly how this tactical heist went down, step by step. First, the Soviet and Chinese aircraft pretended to fly completely out of the city, deliberately clearing the airspace. Second, this created the false impression below of a totally defenseless target. It was irresistible bait. Finally, when the Japanese bombers arrived, expecting an easy run, the defending planes instantly reversed course and ambushed them. In a blindingly fast engagement, they shot down 36 enemy aircraft in just 30 minutes. It was a stunning tactical victory. But
We have to remember that victories like this were never free. The Soviet shield held, but it came at a really heavy, tragic cost. 236. That's the number of Soviet airmen who actually sacrificed their lives fighting in those skies to protect China.
And it's so vital to humanize those massive casualty numbers. Take the incredible story of Group Captain Grigory Timoshenko. During a really fierce battle over Wuhan, his plane sustained critical damage. Now, instead of instantly bailing out and saving himself, he deliberately wrestled with the controls. He literally steered his falling, burning plane away from the densely populated civilian areas below, ultimately crashing into the Yangtze River and drowning. His heroic sacrifice was so deeply appreciated that the local Chinese people actually raised a monument specifically to honor him.
The defense was paid for in bravery and blood, for sure, but it wasn't destined to last forever. Which brings us to Section 5, a sudden departure. You see, global geopolitics shifted with just violent speed. By 1940, the terrifying threat of Nazi Germany looming over Europe forced the Soviets to begin a gradual recall of their volunteer pilots. But the final, definitive blow, that came on June 22, 1941, when Germany officially invaded the Soviet Union. The shield protecting China was violently ripped away as the Soviets suddenly faced a catastrophic fight for survival on their own soil. To really understand why this withdrawal had to be so immediate and total, just look at the devastating scale of that June 1941 invasion. 4,614. That is the number of airplanes the Soviets lost in just the first 9 days of the German offensive. An apocalyptic loss of hardware like that forced an immediate, total halt to all aid going to China. They literally had to bring every available resource home.
Which brings us to this absolutely terrifying final reality. With the total Soviet departure, China was once again staring directly into the abyss. 0 defending planes standing against an overwhelming armada of 800 Japanese fighting aircraft. The shield was gone. The defenseless skies had returned. And that leaves us with a monumental historical cliffhanger. With the skies over China completely defenseless once more, who would step up to fill this newly reopened, desperate vacuum? What you really should take away from this explainer is that history is a giant chain reaction, because it was exactly this terrifying void left behind by the forgotten Soviet volunteers that finally paved the way for Claire Chennault to realize his long-held dream. A dream of creating an American volunteer group, the legendary pilots we all now remember as